Welcome to EPG Pathshala. This paper is the philosophy of law. The current module is legal reasoning amidst critiques of reason. The objectives of this module are to understand the nature and problems that legal reasoning faces due to post-Enlightenment critiques of reason and rationality. This module was written by me, Akash Singh Rathore, from the Lewis University of Rome. When we use the term legal reasoning, we can think of it in three different domains or spheres of activity. At the lowest level, you can understand legal reasoning as the sort of reasoning that's practiced by litigators in a court, like prosecution or defense attorneys. If you go one tier higher, you can understand legal reasoning as being that kind of reasoning employed by the judge in that very same court, or alternatively, by the sort of reasoning that is employed by legislators in a parliamentary body. And still one level higher, legal reasoning can refer to the sort of reasoning that is employed by members of a constituent assembly, for example, while drafting or debating the drafting of a constitution. So these three domains of legal reasoning, the lowest one, that of litigators, the next, the medium level, that of judges and lawmakers, and then the highest level, that of members of a constituent assembly, can all be understood as types of legal reasoning. Now, the legal aspect in all of this is quite clear to see, but what is the reasoning aspect? What is meant by reason or rationality as such? The basic idea is that rationality refers to the capacity of human beings to perform certain functions or have certain capabilities in line with the rules of rationality. In other words, in lines with the rules of standard logic, in lines with the rules of probability theory or decision theory. So the format of classical standard logic, of understanding probability and being able to work with it, and of making decisions in line with classical decision theory, is understood to constitute the meaning and significance of reasoning or of being rational. So in this module, what we're going to explore is how do we have that kind of legal reasoning that I had discussed in those three levels in line with the critiques of the possibilities of humans to be even rational. So in the post-Enlightenment era, what we've experienced are critiques of the possibility, the actual cognitive capacities of human beings to reason in line with standard models of logic, with decision theory, with probability theory. And in that sense, the argument is put forward in a post-Enlightenment world that human beings are scarcely reasonable. If there is some validity to this critique, then we have to ask ourselves, how is it possible to reason legally if we cannot reason at all? There's a classical understanding about the nature and normativity of reasoning, which asserts that competent reasoning operates in line with the rules that I had mentioned. That is, the canons of rational inference, classical logic, probability theory, and decision theory. The philosopher Edward Stein has referred to this as the standard picture, and let me tell you what Stein says. According to this picture, to be rational is to reason in accordance with principles of reasoning that are based on rules of logic, probability theory, and so forth. If the standard picture of reasoning is right, principles of reasoning that are based on such rules are normative principles of reasoning. Namely, they are the principles we ought to reason in accordance with. So if this is the standard picture of reasoning, where we reason according to the normative demands of logic, probability, and decision theory, then what we face is a great skepticism towards any particular individual's actual capacity to reason according to the normative demands. The post-Enlightenment world offered up a variety of critiques of reason from many different disciplines. Philosophy, the one that produced the model of reason itself, underwent a series of critiques of the normativity or cognitive capacity of people to reason throughout the 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. So since the very throning or crowning of reason as the foremost cognitive normative capacity of human beings, that throning or enthronement of reason has been undermined or dethroned by various philosophical critiques of reason, which we refer to as post-Enlightenment critiques. In addition to philosophy, there have been critiques coming from the domain of mathematics. So what we find is that 19th century mathematics undermines or begins to undermine the classical conception of rationality. And in the 20th century, logic itself, which we have always looked at as the final refuge for the belief that human beings are rational, because we can engage in logic, articulate our ideas logically, and so on. Logic itself in the 20th century has begun to undermine the standard picture that human beings reason according to the canons of logic. In addition to these critiques that have come from philosophy from the 17th century to today, from math primarily in the 19th century, from logic in the early 20th century especially, there is also a fourth domain or discipline where critiques of rationality emerge very strongly, and that is in contemporary cognitive science or brain science. What a lot of cognitive science shows is that the standard picture of rationality, which I had earlier presented with the quotation by the philosopher Stein, is a picture that doesn't correspond to any actual human being. In actual practices, human beings do not make rational decisions. So these four domains or critiques of rationality will, of course, bear heavily on lawyers and their suggestion that we reason rationally and that domains of rational reasoning in different aspects of the law are articulations of legal reasoning. So these four different domains that criticize reason and rationality, including philosophy, mathematics, logic, and cognitive science, all suggest that legal reasoning is quite suspect. When lawyers argue that the sort of reasoning that we employ in the courtroom, in the parliament, in the Constitutional Convention are various manifestations of legal reasoning, well, the legal aspect is quite clear, but is it reasoning, is it rational at all? The different kinds of critiques of reason and rationality make the very idea of legal reasoning suspect. So we're going to now go through these different critiques, the philosophical, the mathematical, the logical, and the cognitive science critiques of reason and rationality in order to see whether the notion of legal reasoning can be rescued from these post-Enlightenment critiques of reason. Even farther, what we're going to suggest towards the end of this module is that not only is there hope for legal reasoning, and we'll discuss the reasons why, but that hope is also useful to the other disciplines as a means of rescuing the critique of rationality that they are in a process of articulating. So let's begin with the philosophical post-Enlightenment critiques of reason. With the very emergence of the Enlightenment in the 16th, especially the 17th century, we got a conception of rationality as the primary authority. Reason was the most important faculty of man. It was what man shared with God, being fundamentally rational, and man's reason was in some way his creation in the image of God. God is purely rational. The highest part of man is reason and rationality. Now this suggestion not only asserts what reason is, but it dethrones earlier contenders for the highest forms of authority. So, for example, God as such, God's, we can say, arbitrary will, could be seen as the highest or sovereign power to which we must all be obedient. But in the process of the Enlightenment, the position of reason and of an individual man's fundamental capacity to be rational, to display rationality, to think critically and rationally, undermined the authority of various arbitrary powers. So let's say having to listen to the arbitrary power of others, or having to succumb to ideas such as mere faith. So the position that reason took in the Enlightenment was not only a positive statement about man's fundamental rationality, it was also in some way destructive in dethroning earlier authorities, whether that authority was the patriarch, whether it was the sovereign, the king, the monarch, whether it was God itself. In the process of articulating this triumph of reason, there were internal criticisms against rationality. So even those who we consider great Enlightenment thinkers and proponents of reason, such as Thomas Hobbes or later the German philosopher Hegel, in some way offered seeds within their own thought that served to later flourish as critiques of reason and rationality. So Thomas Hobbes, if you will remember, had suggested that reason serves, or more exactly thoughts, serves as scouts and spies for the passions. So basically, it is the passions that have us motivate. David Hume argued something quite similar when he argued that passions reign supreme. Reason or rationality is rather something that we bring in afterwards to give a gloss on what is actually motivating us, which is our passions. So both before Hume in Hobbes and after Hume in Hegel, the ironic side to this is that all of these philosophers were crucial to the advancement of the supremacy of reason and rationality. After all, it was Hegel who had argued that the real is the rational and the rational is the real. So how is it that these philosophers who championed reason can also be the seeds for the post-Enlightenment critique of reason? Well, I've already mentioned in Hobbes and Hume. In Hegel, you can think about Hegel's logic. Hegel's logic suggests that the classical canons of logic, which are the principles primarily of excluded middle and non-contradiction, are not in fact the great achievements of logical thought. Rather, they're small, local articulations of the canons of logic that don't have much to say about the real nature of the world. In the real nature of the world, contradictions are suspended. So Hegel in his logic had argued that the classical conceptions of logic, the classical canons of logic, namely the principle of non-contradiction and the principles of excluded middle, are conceptions or logical principles that are valid only locally. They don't have much sense in explaining the nature of the real world. In the real world, contradictions are present everywhere, and the nature of any given thing within the real world, if properly conceived, is to conceive its suspension or the way that it sustains contradictions. Now, the argument here then is that while Hegel is attempting to argue the supremacy of rationality, he is at the same time undermining the classical canons of rationality. So, in the earlier case of Hobbes, where we see that reason is the foundation of the social contract and all subsequent decisions that we make to create political society, that reason itself is somewhat a handmaiden to the passions. Hume's critique of reason and rationality is well known. It's that which awoke Kant from his dogmatic slumber. And Hegel's articulation of reason and rationality is ironically itself possible to be deployed as a further or deeper critique of reason, since his argument for promoting rationality relies on undermining certain aspects of classical logic. Another philosopher around the time of Hegel, in fact, who responded very negatively to Hegel, is Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard had presented us with a variety of arguments suggesting that rationality hardly even touches upon the most important things in the world, which include, of course, faith, love, art. What does reason have to do with any of the things that are most important? Later on in the continuation of this post-Enlightenment critiques of reason, we get an intriguing position by the German philosopher Theodor Adorno. Adorno had suggested that reason can culminate in evil. So far from it being the access by which human beings make intelligent, positive, favorable decisions, Adorno had suggested that the culmination of evil is rationality in its pure form. So his identity, an even more radical critique of reason, was put forward by the German philosopher Theodor Adorno, who did not remark on the ineffectiveness or impossibility of rationality, but rather he suggested that reason in its Enlightenment form culminates in evil. The Nazi death camps, for example, could be seen as a high and consistent expression of rationality. So his critique is very different from the standard Enlightenment idea that it is reason that liberates us from evil. Adorno's argument is that reason can culminate in evil. The French philosopher Michel Foucault also served to dethrone reason from its authoritative position. According to Foucault, humans simply have no faculty of reason as was classically conceived, that is, as transcendent, objective, gender-neutral, class-neutral, culture-neutral, timeless, disinterested, and so on. This sort of gender-neutral, objective, transcendent model of reason that just follows logical laws, decisions, and probability doesn't exist. It's a fiction. This kind of critique of Foucault was carried forward by the American pragmatist Richard Rorty, for whom reason is nothing like the substantive, transcendent, or eternal cognitive capacity pictured in the standard model that we had started with. Rather, reason is empty. It's precautionary. All it tells us is, be careful, double check, concentrate, draw valid inferences, and so on. So in this respect, rationality is dethroned from the high place that it has in the Enlightenment and reduced to something nothing other than an admonition to be cautious. Finally, Jacques Derrida, the French philosopher, made this critique of reason even more specific by pointing out that reason is only justified circularly. In other words, if you want to argue in favor of reason, you're using reason to do it. And this violates the rules of valid reasoning, since circular reasoning is invalid reasoning. In other words, Derrida argued that reason itself presents itself as fallacious. If reason is justified by reason, then how do we exclude supplanting self-justified authorities, such as emotion or feeling? In other words, someone can suggest that feeling is more authoritative than reason, arguing that we can't understand his position because we don't feel it. So what this final post-Enlightenment critique of reason serves to do is to show the fundamental circularity of the defense of reason and rationality. And if the defense of reason and rationality is circular, then how do we exclude or prevent other circular arguments from supplanting reason? So if these are the post-Enlightenment philosophical critiques of reason, how about the other critiques that I had mentioned? For example, we can now turn to cognitive sciences critiques of reason and rationality. The form that the cognitive science critique takes is not in suggesting that there is anything wrong with the canons of logic or the model of decision theory or reasoning according to probability. Cognitive science accepts all of these as being valid ways to assess the normativity of rationality. So we should conform to classical logic. We should make our decisions according to probability and decision theory. The problem is that in clinical experiments and studies, nobody ever does so. So even if reason and rationality is the norm that should be followed, what cognitive science shows us is that empirically, reason and rationality is very, very rare. The kind of studies that cognitive science has shown to illustrate this can be grouped into a few different headings. One is referred to as the selection task. The other we can call base rate neglect. Let me discuss these two first. In the 1960s, Peter Wason conducted a study of standard reasoning problems known as the selection task. The study subsequently sparked so much research that scholars suggest that the selection task is the most deeply researched problem in the psychology of reasoning. The task subjects are faced with is to select answers to problems in order to determine the subject's apprehension of basic laws of formal logic, such as modus ponens and its variations, modus tollens, and so on. What research has consistently found over the years is that the vast majority of people perform very poorly at selection task problems. What this suggests is that the laws of logic and the basic principles of soundness and validity in reasoning are not cognitively accessible to most people in actual experience. So what we see through these experiments is that we have the norms of logical reasoning, but experientially what we find is that people are just not cognitively capable of governing their own thoughts according to the canons of logic, probability, and decision. That means that the plain statement that people are rational is actually open to empirical challenge, because in any given selection task, we find that very few people are in fact rational. The next study we're going to look at is referred to as base rate neglect. This base rate neglect set of experiments has decisively illustrated that people have strong tendencies to substitute bias or stereotypes or prejudice for factual information. That factual information we can refer to as a base rate. So, in other words, rather than reasoning from the factual information, this base rate neglect series of experiments shows that most people substitute their bias and their prejudice for rational logical thinking. Let me give you an example. If we assume that in a sample of 100 people, 20% are businessmen and 80% are farmers, when subjects are asked about the likelihood that one of those persons who happens to be wearing an expensive watch is a businessman or a farmer, the answer that is routinely given is that more than 50% likely that this person is a businessman. Now what this does is ignores the base rate information that what we know the facts are that 20% are farmers, 80% are businessmen. So any one person out of 100 who comes in front of you to ask what is the likelihood that they're a farmer or a businessman, the answer, the logical, the rational answer has to be that it's 80% likely they're a businessman, 20% likely they're a farmer, or vice versa, depending on how the experiment works. But what people end up doing is ignoring that 20-80 fact and offering suggestions that it's far more likely that someone with an expensive watch is a businessman. Now, of course, perhaps it's true that it's more likely in general that someone with an expensive watch is a businessman rather than a farmer. In general, that may or may not be true, but in this specific case, we have been given base rate information telling us 20% are one type, 80% are another. Now that is not going to change no matter what the person is wearing. There are two other kinds of experiments in addition to the base rate neglect and the selection task. One is referred to as the conjunction fallacy, and the other we refer to as overconfidence. These other sets of experiments or results that have been found further illustrate the fact that people are scarcely rational in the real world. The conjunction fallacy provides people the opportunity to select what is more likely. Is it more likely, for example, in my case, that I am a male? Is it more likely that I am a philosopher of law? Or is it more likely that I am a male philosopher of law? Now, if we were to organize these three options in terms of their percentage of likelihood, most people seem to show in this kind of experiment that the option that I am a male philosopher of law is more probable that I am either a male or a philosopher of law. But if you think about it, how can one be a male philosopher of law without first being either a male or a philosopher of law? So this is referred to as a conjunction fallacy, where people think that it's more likely to be something conjoined, some conglomerate, than it is to be the individual pieces of that conglomerate. And this violates every rule of classical logic. Now finally, we've discussed the ways that empirically people are shown to prefer bias or various kinds of heuristical thinking rather than actual logical reasoning in the decisions that they make. And yet the fourth set of studies tell us that interestingly, people are overconfident about their skills in logic and logical reasoning. So this fourth group of studies has shown that when you ask people, how do you think you did on the selection task, on the ranking things in terms of probability, and so on, people will always, the studies show, people will always rate themselves as having performed higher than they actually did. So what this altogether cumulatively suggests, and the evidence from cognitive science seems to show quite convincingly, that human beings are in fact not rational, but they are so confident that they are rational that they claim that they are more rational than they are. Now, this kind of cognitive science critique of reason and rationality in its actual functioning in daily life seems to work hand in hand with the post-Enlightenment philosophical critiques of reason and rationality to undermine the very possibility of legal reasoning. As I had mentioned, it's not only the philosophical critiques, but also the cognitive science critiques that work hand in hand to undermine the idea of logical, legal reasoning. But we have always looked to disciplines like mathematics and logic to rescue reason from their critique. The ironic thing is that in the 19th century, especially with the development of non-Euclidean geometries, the geometers or mathematicians' critique of reason became quite pronounced. In other words, reason was demoted from being that authority that can select between different sets of axioms, demoted to simply that capacity that allows us to reason within and through axioms. So this is a reduction of the status of reason from where it stood in a Euclidean world. The same thing happened a century later in logic with the development of non-standard logics. So just as in Euclidean geometry, we had a fifth postulate, which postulated that any two lines that extend in space, if they're drawn on another line lower than 90 degrees, will inevitably touch or meet sometime. This fifth postulate, known as the parallel postulate, was rejected in geometry. Just so, in logic, basic principles or premises in logic, like excluded middle or non-contradiction, were rejected to see what sort of non-standard logic could be created. In the process, what we have for both math and logic of the 19th and 20th century is that the high status of reason to select between better sets of axioms, better sets of logical principles, for example, has been removed from human capacity, so that now human reasoning is merely instrumental and can draw deductions based on whatever axiom set you offer. But we have no capacity to choose between those axiom sets. So in these four different disciplines, philosophy, cognitive science, math, and logic, we have a slow but certain undermine of rationality, of its authority, and especially that sort of rationality that we had referred to as the highest level in legal reasoning, that global sense where in a constituent assembly one chooses between different kinds of constitutions or regimes. You can think of those as axiom sets. One chooses between them, saying, for example, well, democracy is superior to monarchy or to tyranny. That's like saying that Euclidean geometry is superior to non-Euclidean geometry. We have no basis for making such decisions, especially in the light of all of these critiques of reason and rationality. Despite all of these critiques, what we find is that in the adversarial nature of the legal system, I had mentioned the lowest level being litigants in a court of law. This is an adversarial system where certain sides are fighting one against the other. In this adversarial system, there are kind of procedural safeguards put in place which ensure a level playing field, so persons who are subject to the law can recognize the legitimate authority of the legal system to which they are subject. This is referred to as natural justice. In other words, we can see natural justice as a sort of procedural safeguard, a minimal threshold, an axiomatic and universal set of conditions that has to be followed to ensure that we are engaged with a legal system at all. as opposed to an arbitrary exercise of tyrannical power. In a subsequent module devoted to natural justice, the concept will be thoroughly examined. Here, I just want to give you some hint that when we talk about natural justice, we're talking about procedural rules against bias, rules for a fair hearing of both parties that demand that all orders be speaking orders, for example. In other words, all reasons must be articulated so we can find the reason and rationality behind a decision. So if these are the procedural safeguards put in place by a notion of natural justice, what we may have found through natural justice is a procedural safeguard that protects reason against this fourfold critique of reason that we have been unfolding in this module. But where are these principles of natural justice derived? That's precisely the point. They're not derived anywhere. In other words, what's in fundamental importance to the principles of natural justice is that they're not constructed by a random thought experiment like Rawls does in his principles of justice, as will be discussed in later modules. Rather, the demand for the principles of natural justice are demands that are made by each person who appears in a court of law, or even who appears in arbitration to any kind of dispute whatsoever. To put this simply, any one of us who subjects our position or our claim to the judgment of a third party expects that third party to be neutral. If you're having a fight with someone, for example, let's say you're arguing with your sibling, you appeal to your parents because you know your parents are going to be fair. They're not going to be partial to one side or the other side. You also know that they're going to hear both sides of the story. They're not going to assume that one is right and the other is wrong without listening to them. And this is the way that natural justice works. So what is the relationship then between this idea of natural justice and how to rescue legal reasoning from all of the critiques of reason? So now let's bring this discussion of natural justice and in terms of what we've been calling its solution to the critiques of reason into a conclusion. Now let's bring this discussion of natural justice, and as we've been discussing natural justice in line with the critiques of reason, into a summary and conclusion. What we had begun by discussing were three different tiers of legal reasoning. We had the lowest tier, which was the argumentation of litigants, the prosecution or the defense in a court. Now, no matter how we undermine rationality in a grand sense, everybody admits that these sorts of basic drawing inferences from axioms is beyond dispute. That's what the logical, the mathematical, all of the other critiques of grand reason have been relying upon. They have always argued and suggested that reason can be instrumental. What they've questioned is that it can be profoundly transcendent, objective, and standing over and above all particular instances like caste, class, and gender, and so on. So the ability of litigants to reason has never really been undermined by the critiques of reason. What about the highest level then, that of the Constituent Assembly? The Constituent Assembly is tasked with the job of choosing between different sets of axioms. So choosing between, for example, in the mathematical example, a fifth postulate-based geometry or a geometry, a non-Euclidean geometry that rejects the fifth postulate. The critiques of rationality have told us we have no place to stand to choose between these two axiom sets. What the turn to natural justice as basic fundamental principles of legal reasoning procedurally has shown us is that there is always going to be, in conformity with human nature empirically, a demand by each individual that the axiom set, or let's say the constitution that is decided upon by the Constituent Assembly, be one with rational procedural safeguards. And if that's the case, then we have just found a way through natural justice to overcome the critiques of reason that say that we have no way of choosing between rival axiom sets. The assertion here, the hidden premise, is to assume that everyone will rather choose freedom over tyranny. But I don't think that's such a crazy assumption to make for a rational person. What about then that middle domain, The middle domain we had mentioned was, on the one hand, the judges in that very court of law, or on the other hand, the legislators in Parliament. Well, here's where the cognitive critiques of reason really take their toll. Is it possible for a judge to transcend bias? Is it possible for lawmakers to transcend self-interest and actually come up with decisions or laws that are in the best interests of the community at large? Cognitive science would seem to suggest that we have no cognitive capacity to come up with purely rational decisions. Well, we can't solve that problem here, but what we can perhaps offer is that at least what natural justice does allow us to see is that if we implement and guarantee certain procedural safeguards, then at least what is lost in the cognitive capacity of those agents who are deciding or making law for us can be in some way regained or agitated against through proper procedural instruments, such as implementing administratively the Code of Natural Justice, that will allow us to overcome whatever bad decisions or irrational decisions that are made at that level. Thank you.